everyone, and welcome to PV Magazine USA Week. We're here on day 2, navigating the U.S. supply chain. I'm Ryan Kennedy, senior editor with PV Magazine USA. I'm reporting live from Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'll be moderating this live broadcast, a virtual conference where we're bringing together some of the leading experts in the solar industry to discuss the most pressing issues in solar and storage in the U.S. Over the past year, the U.S. solar industry has navigated a period of sweeping change. Despite early pledges of an all-the-above energy approach, federal actions have shifted away from supporting solar deployment, and developers and investors are now facing a tougher landscape that's marked with new tax credit limitations, import restrictions, and reduced federal funding, challenges that demand renewed creativity and resilience across the sector. During this PV Magazine USA Week 2025, we'll discuss these challenges and look at how the industry is meeting the moment to accelerate solar build-out in a more difficult terrain. Yesterday, we discussed project finance, tax credit deadlines, and the road ahead for solar post-tax credits. Tomorrow in day 3, we'll take a look at distributed energy as a solution, looking at rooftop solar and storage, commercial and industrial sectors, as well as community solar as tools for resilience, cost clarity, and rapid deployment. And once again, welcome to PV Magazine USA Week. Let's get started with day 2. Our focus today is navigating the U.S. supply chain. A steady supply of modules, inverters, trackers, and energy storage systems is needed to advance the energy transition in the United States, but a web of supply challenges and manufacturing capabilities, it grows increasingly complex. Solar module manufacturing in the United States is booming, with as much as 65 gigawatts of module assembly and 13 gigawatts of solar cell manufacturing expected to come online by the end of the year. However, this is not enough to meet forecast demand for the industry, and many factories have been canceled due to challenges created by a shifting domestic industrial policy. For imports, suppliers navigate numerous challenges, including foreign entity of concern restrictions on tax credit eligibility, widespread tariffs, anti-dumping and countervailing duty rules and tariffs, UFLPA restrictions, and more. Today's session will explore the challenges of the U.S. supply chain, the push towards U.S. manufacturing, and the navigation of trade restrictions and compliance. And attendees will walk away today with a better understanding of the U.S. supply chain landscape. In just a moment, we'll hear from our keynote speaker, Keith Martin, partner at Norton Fulbright, U.S. We'll address federal policy changes, including FEOC restrictions, trade and tariff considerations, and best practices for securing tax credits before the deadline, including for project development considerations. After the keynote, we'll hear from Brett Henderson, CEO and co-founder at SPR, who will deliver a presentation on the role of solar panel recycling in the supply chain. Then we'll take a 10-minute break, and we come back on the other side with a panel discussion that includes experts from Anza, Intertek CEA, and REC Group, extending our discussion on supply chain issues, manufacturing build-out, and procurement in the new regulatory landscape. And after the panel, we'll hear from Eric Goodwin of OMCO Solar about their participation as a U.S. tracker supplier. Before we hear from Keith Martin, I want to give a special thanks to our partners, our lead partner, Create Energy, our platinum partner, Trina Solar, as well as our gold partners, Intertek CEA, Q-Cells, and REC Group. Thanks to our viewers for joining today. You can check the agenda in the handout section. And if you have any questions, you can submit them to the Q&A section, and we'll try to address as many audience questions as we can. Each day, we're also giving away a 1-year digital subscription to PV Magazine to one lucky attendee. So make sure you're participating and paying attention. We'll have a prize reveal. You could be our winner. Now, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and move forward to our keynote session. I'll introduce our speaker. We're joined today by Keith Martin, partner with Norton Fulbright, US. Martin is a tax lawyer in the Washington office of Norton Rose Fulbright, who has helped lead the project finance group at the firm for more than 25 years. The group did $283 billion in project financing and closed more than 600 transactions in the last 5 years. He worked for 214 companies last year on numerous transactions, and he lobbies in the U.S. Treasury and Congress on policy issues. He was counsel to Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan and legislative assistant to Senator Henry H. Jackson before moving on to private law practice. The prestigious Chambers Directory gives him the sole star ranking among U.S. renewable energy lawyers. Thanks for joining us today, Keith.
My pleasure, Ryan. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it. So a lot has changed since we've held our event last year. Whole new set of tax considerations, trade and tariff considerations. Let's start here with FEOC, or Foreign Entity of Concern. What can you tell us about what are FEOC restrictions, and what remaining guidance is the industry waiting to better understand compliance with FEOC?
Well, let me start with the easy part. There is no guidance. So the industry is waiting for so-called skinny guidance that is expected near the end of the year, probably late December. And that would be a notice of some sort from the Treasury that addresses the most pressing issues. Then proposed regulations, which would be more comprehensive, are not expected before the spring next year. What is FEOC? First, understand it's a possible reason to deny tax credits on projects. And it only applies to so-called technology neutral tax credits. These are tax credits on projects that start construction this year or later. There are many projects in the market currently that were under construction by the end of last year. They are not affected by FEOC. FEOC requires a three-step analysis. The question is, at the end of that analysis, do you get technology neutral tax credits on your project? Step one is a limit on the amount of Chinese equipment that can be used in the project. Step two is a prohibition against companies that have, U.S. companies, that have too much Chinese equity, debt, or involvement in management from claiming those tax credits. And step three, which is the most difficult, is a look at all of the contracts that a project has. The developer needs to identify any contracts with so-called specified foreign entities. These are basically companies that are more than 50% Chinese owned, and then scrub those contracts of any provisions that grant the Chinese counterparty effective control over any key aspect of the project. So three-step analysis.
Great. And so we're still awaiting guidance. Could you talk a little bit about what the uncertainty around that guidance means for projects moving forward, and maybe any kind of vision into when guidance should be expected?
Well, the law firms that are working in this area are getting more comfortable with the statutory language. We have all been working with it since May, when it first appeared in House versions of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. So the market is functioning more or less. The big unanswered questions are, I'd say there are two big ones. One is suppliers of equipment need to provide certificates to their customers, indicating that they are not prohibited foreign entities. Basically, they don't have more than 25% Chinese equity ownership, more than 15% Chinese debt. No Chinese companies have the right to appoint board members or senior officers, things like this. Those certificates are supposed to say that the supplier is not only that the supplier is not a prohibited foreign entity, but it is not aware of any prohibited foreign entities in the chain of production. It's not clear why that is relevant, because the way people calculate the limits on Chinese equipment does not require looking upstream in the supply chain. So that's one question the Treasury needs to answer: why do the certificates need to say anything about the upstream supply chain? Another question is these limits on contracts with Chinese counterparties that give the counterparties effective control over some aspect of the project apply retroactively. If you have such a contract under which you made payments in 2025, it will prevent tax credits from being claimed in 2026. People are hoping for some relief from the U.S. Treasury on the retroactive aspect of that. As far as timing, as I said before, a notice is expected by year end, so-called skinny guidance addressing the most pressing issues. There's limited capacity at the IRS to tackle a lot of issues between now and then. The IRS is already working on this guidance, but the government shutdown could have an effect. There are 45 lawyers at the IRS who've been called back during the shutdown to help with guidance. So hopefully this will not be slowed.
Thank you. And you mentioned sort of the project developer side of FEOC implications. Does FEOC also apply to 45X? And what are some best practices for manufacturers that are looking to secure that tax credit related to FEOC?
It does. I wrote a paper called Working Through the FEOC Maze that you can find online. Put in the title, Working Through the FEOC Maze, Norton and Rose. It will take you through the three-step analysis, both what a developer should do and also what a manufacturer should do. It's a slightly different analysis. What manufacturers have been doing is asking law firms like ours for opinions on whether their products have too much Chinese equipment and whether they have contracts with suppliers that grant the suppliers effective control over the product. The law firms are working with these manufacturers to try to clean things up and then give an opinion that the manufacturers are entitled to 45X credits. The most difficult thing is technology rights. And this is particularly a problem in the battery area. If a license is signed on or after July 4, 2025, giving a manufacturer or a customer, developer, rights to use intellectual property belonging to a Chinese company, that automatically is considered effective control. So what the law firms are doing is striking those sorts of technology rights and replacing them with a promise by the manufacturer or the equipment supplier not to sue and not to assert that technology rights are being violated and sue, rather than have a license to use them.
So would you say that FEOC is causing greater challenges for the battery supply chain than the solar supply chain?
Yes and no. Yes on batteries, because 69 to 77% of equipment for lithium-ion batteries is coming currently from China. No, because many solar developers are rushing currently to start construction of projects ahead of a deadline so that they will have 4 years to finish rather than just the end of 2027. And they are finding more and more limited options. And so we are seeing more equipment contracts with Chinese companies coming in for review. And that's just a sign of the difficulty here.
Thank you. So one could view a trade-off between procuring a low-cost module or purchasing in the U.S. a higher cost but surely compliant module. How are tax equity investors currently quantifying and pricing the tax credit recapture risk associated with importing equipment that may have residual exposure to FEOC? And how does this sort of affect the debt sizing and final cost of capital for a transaction?
The short answer is they are not. Most of the deals in the market for financing this year are so-called legacy tax credit deals. These are projects that were under construction. By the end of last year, they are not affected by FEOC. We're just starting to see the first projects that have to comply with FEOC, and where people bring in Chinese equipment, they must start construction by the end of this year in order to be exempted from the first part of the FEOC test, the limits on use of Chinese equipment. They still will be subject to the contract payment provisions, the effective control provisions. And so they need to scrub those contracts of any technology licenses, anything that gives the Chinese counterparty effective control. I think when these projects do reach the tax equity market, this risk will be handled by law firm opinions. The tax equity investors will get opinions from their counsel that everything is okay. If they're worried, they may ask for tax insurance to shed the risk to a tax insurer. But in general, tax equity investors do not invest into insurance claims. They have to be confident there's no problem.
Thank you. Now, adding in UFLPA to the picture, UFLPA is enforced by customs and comes with risk of products being detained, while FEOC is enforced by the IRS and leads to tax credit denial if you're not in compliance. From a project finance perspective, which policy poses the more immediate and financially threatening situation for bankability and the closing of a project's transaction today?
Well, there are both challenges, but they're challenges for different reasons. The challenge with the UFLPA is that customs will detain equipment that is needed to build the project. That is a big concern for a construction lender who's taking construction risk and may allow construction draws before all the equipment is in the United States. But it's of less concern to a tax equity investor. The tax equity investor will not fund until the earliest once the project has been physically completed. On FEOC, I think this is just like any other box that must be checked in order to confirm the tax credits are present. And so the law firms will either get comfortable or the deal will not close. That's just how this works. People ask about, IRS enforcement. The IRS doesn't show up on the scene for 4 years later until after the project has been built. There's a 3-year statute of limitations audit. It's 3 years from when the tax return is filed. That's the year after the project is completed. The real enforcement of these rules is the financial market. The tax equity investors, the lenders, they will not finance unless they feel comfortable.
Thank you. Now moving to the project side of things and 4080. On the project side, to safe harbor the 4080 investment tax credit, projects must show physical work of a significant nature. This sort of replaced the traditional 5% capital expenditure test that used to help with safe harboring. Can you explain the current state of tax credit safe harboring with beginning projects, and what are some of the best practices that you'd recommend to demonstrate physical work of a significant nature to qualify?
Let me be clear. The physical work option to start construction is the sole way to start construction for projects on which construction starts after September 1 this year. If solar or wind projects started construction before, they had two options. They could start under the 5% test. On best practices, we like to see at least 250,000 in physical work done by the deadline. If you ask the tax equity investors how much they want, they will say the more the better. The IRS has never drawn a clear line. The state of play right now is it's becoming harder and harder for people to find equipment that can be made at the factory and count. You can count physical work at a factory on equipment that has been specially tailored for use in the project, or you can count work at the project site. The market as a whole is comfortable with work on the main power transformer because the IRS said that works. The market is less comfortable with anything else, trackers, inverters, inverter skids. You have a split in the market among tax counsel about whether what is made at the factory must be specially tailored for use in the project. That's our position. Or whether it's enough just to point out that the factory doesn't make this equipment unless it has an order. There are some people who believe that's the only test. If that's the only test, then almost all equipment works. Coming back to best practices, if you start work on the project site, you need to build up, not tear down. So demolition or site clearance doesn't work. You need to work on things on which an investment tax credit can be claimed. So security fences don't count, but the substation does count, the main power transformer, the steel piles that you're erecting. Roads don't count unless they are just on the site. They're not access roads that permit access to the site. So most solar started construction is on steel piles. We like to see 10 to 20% of them, but at least 250,000 in physical work. Go back to the factory. Main power transformer is the only surefire way. So those are your options.
Great. And when could the market expect to know when other components outside of main power transformers would qualify? What would that process look like?
That's a process that plays out with the tax equity investors and their counsel. The law firms like ours that primarily represent sponsors have been besieged over the last few months by sponsors who want to count all sorts of things that the law firms are not that comfortable with. And I'm sure some sponsors will go to the tax equity market with things that people are generally not comfortable with. The tax insurance market will have a role. If it gets comfortable, that may help facilitate financings based on other things besides main power transformers.
Thanks. And one of the a facet that was potentially going to be on the chopping block in the one big beautiful bill was tax credit transferability. It ended up being retained. How are things going with the transferability market? Do you see any emerging risks with it, especially with sort of a tax credit cliff coming up? And what does the outlook look like for transferability?
It's healthy. We ourselves have done 10.7 billion in tax credit sales in the last 27 months. So that's anywhere from 25 to 31% of the market, depending on the year. The market is functioning fine. There are issues here and there. Probably the most significant one has been where companies unwittingly restructure and they change the characterization of their companies during the year without realizing that they need then to have different entities sell the tax credits that accrued during the year, and they need to have them file separately on the registration portal for the IRS.
Thanks. And with tax credits going away in the future, some industry members are fearful or warning of a cliff of product build out and capacity once they expire. Do you see risk of a cliff effect, and how do things look in 2027, 28, and beyond in the post-ITC world?
Good question. Right now, the larger developers have strong pipelines of projects that were under construction by the end of last year, and were not affected by the OMCO or FEOC. They are in head-down execution mode that will carry them through 2026. There have been project cancellations. The Energy Information Administration, which is part of the U.S. Department of Energy, I think said solar capacity additions are now expected to be down 50% this year from what was expected earlier. Part of that is due to permitting issues, although it's not clear how many projects are affected. There is agency pile-on in Washington, starting with the Department of Interior, where the secretary said no approvals will be granted for solar or wind projects unless he personally signs off on them. Our own real estate lawyers think maybe about 5% of projects have a federal touch point that is affected, but that is expanding as the Department of Transportation, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Environmental Protection Agency, others, U.S. Department of Agriculture have piled on and also erecting obstacles. I think 27 and 28, what happens there will be affected somewhat by the midterm elections at the end of next year. We've seen this picture before. These tax credits have existed since 1992. They have gone, come back multiple times. So it's possible there'd be some trade that brings back some of it, particularly as the electricity shortages in the U.S. become more severe and AI starts to be affected. In the longer term, the International Energy Agency put out a graph showing capacity additions globally. The line for renewables is a steeply up rising curve. This is for the period 2005 through 2024. The line for fossil fuel capacity additions is a slowly declining curve that has nothing to do with tax credits, nothing to do with any of these incentives in the US. It's pure economics. I think that is what will drive the picture ultimately.
Thank you. And you mentioned that some agencies, Army Corps of Engineers, Department of Transportation, there could be more shoes to drop as far as obstructing solar projects. Are there any specific threats that you've heard from these groups that might be emerging, or is this just, there's a general sort of disposition against solar, so there's a possibility of that risk?
Just a general disposition there. The newer threats are tariff related. There is a proceeding underway now to impose tariffs on polysilicon imports, to impose tariffs on solar panels coming in through Indonesia and India and Laos. And then there are copper tariffs there are rumors that those could reach downstream products that use copper. All of this is a part of the unpredictable side of the equation. There are labor shortages. The immigration crackdown has affected the construction trades. We had a panel discussion at our annual conference this year about the shift to gas. Two things that came out of that were, if you order a gas turbine today for a combined cycle gas-fired power plant, you won't get it before 2030, 2 years beyond the current Trump term. And second, the gas developers are telling us they can't find construction crews that can build for them. And that's also affecting solar. People are just working flat out.
Thanks. Yeah, and you touched on briefly there, there's new emergent AD/CVD cases, India, Laos. What kind of impact are you seeing on the market from this new round of investigations, and what's sort of the timeline ahead for the determinations on those cases?
It's very difficult to do work. As one CFO told us, he goes to bed and the tariff is 25%. He wakes up, it's 100%, just as a result of a Truth Social posting. I think the market has accommodated itself to the idea that there will not be certainty here. They just have to live in this realm. And where things have settled is the equipment suppliers bear all the known tariffs when the agreement is signed. And then there is a split of some sort, 50-50, 20-80, whatever, of the next 30% of tariffs or some percentage. And then above that, the customer can walk away and find the equipment somewhere else. That's not a very satisfactory resolution because many power contracts have liquidated damages clauses that must be paid, or liquidated damages must be paid if the project is late coming online. So it's not a happy situation. The best approach for the developers is to find an off-taker who has the ability to pass through costs like utilities. We've found people going back 2, 3, even 4 times to get price increases. And surprisingly, in many cases, the off-takers are willing to do it. And what they want in return is more renewable electricity at the higher price just because they can't find it elsewhere. We've seen retail electricity prices increase 5% since July. We saw the wholesale prices increase, I think, 41% in PJM in the first 7 months this year. This is just a sign of the supply shortages. This is a looming political problem in the U.S.
Yeah, and these supply shortages probably are expected to continue into the future, I imagine, with data center build out and that kind of thing. Yeah, let's see. We probably have time for one more question here, see if there's anything from the audience. One audience member was wondering, is it true that projects less than 1.5 megawatts can still safe harbor using the 5% spend rule?
Yes, and I'm glad he or she pointed that out. Projects that are up to 1.5 megawatts have 2 options for starting construction. 5% test, meaning incur at least 5% of the total project cost, or physical work, the type that I described.
Thank you. Just seeing what else we have from the audience here. Yeah, so any final thoughts on sort of best practices for project developers? There's pretty complex web of tariffs, trade restrictions, all these things. What do you recommend that project developers do to carry through this time of project prioritization, and maybe some resources they can access to make sure they're on the right track for compliance?
Look at your development pipeline. Try to accelerate the projects that have the best chance of making it. If you can finish by the end of 2027, you don't have to worry about starting construction. If you need more time, then you do need to start by July 4 next year. If you rely on Chinese intellectual property, or if you rely on Chinese equipment, start construction by the end of this year. And for that purpose, you have both the 5% test and physical work test available. For tariffs, be clear in the contract about who's bearing the tariffs. Put in the contract that if there is a refund of duties that have been paid, if you're a customer, you will get the tariffs back, even if they were built into the purchase price. The Supreme Court is hearing arguments on whether Trump had authority to impose about half the tariffs he's imposed. Those oral arguments are on November 5th. There could be huge refunds. And if so, customers need to put that in the contracts, otherwise they will not be entitled to a share of them. On customs duties, on UFLPA, our trade lawyers say, don't sign a contract for equipment until you see the supply chain map all the way back to the raw materials to make sure there is no forced labor.
Great. Well, I think that's a great place to close it. Thanks so much, Keith, for all your insights today. Lot to navigate right now, but helps to have some really clear guidance. Appreciate it.
Thanks again for having me. So long, Ryan.
Thanks. Great. So next up, we will turn our attention to All right, so next we'll turn our attention to Brett Henderson from SPR to discuss solar panel recycling. Brett Henderson is the CEO and co-founder of SPR and VP of the parent company, Powerhouse Recycling Inc. With over 16 years in recycling, he champions the circular economy. Brett pioneered advanced commercial scale solar recycling technologies for major U.S. energy companies and utilities. He currently serves on the NCDEQ Circular Economy Advisory Council and the SIA STC 602 Recycling Committee. Brett, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Ryan.
I'll hand it over to you for now. Thank you.
Great. Well, wonderful keynote to get us started here, and some different topics and concerns that Keith had brought up, I think could tie in throughout this presentation. So we'll get going. Before we bring the solar panel recycling side of things in the U.S. market all the way to the supply chain opportunities and challenges, it's important to first set the stage. Why is a U.S. solar recycling market coming to light? How is it growing? Where are we at with it? And first and foremost, we need to look at the potential volume here in the U.S. The EU and the Asian markets typically are a bit ahead in the recycling world, and they are again in the solar side of things. But what makes the U.S. A much more unique market is the most obvious is some of the panel quantities that are installed in the United States, but also how wide geographically it is, where transportation really brings in a major a factor in planning for these projects. So first and foremost, by 2030, the IEE and IRENA anticipate 1 million tons of solar panels hitting the recycling stream or end of life, and by 2050 in the U.S. about 10 million tons. What we have actually seen at SPR's facilities, we have recycling facilities located in North Carolina, Georgia, and West Texas, is panels hitting the end of life, much quicker than anticipated in the U.S. market. So our data shows that there'll be greater than 1 million tons by 2030 and greater than 10 million tons by 2050. There has been some updated data going back to that last graph that has kind of shown that more panels are hitting end of life sooner in the U.S. And there's a few reasons for that. So, obviously the manufacturers have the expected panel life of 25 to 30 years. But what we have seen so far through our facility is an average about 11 years. First and foremost, you have repowers and tech upgrades. So, that particular project in the United States, those panels still very well may have life left in them, still very well may be working, but you now have the ability to go to market and get 600-700 watt panels, 800 watt panels versus the 200 watt installed. So we've seen panels getting swapped out at projects sooner than actually becoming obsolete and or defective. Weather events obviously speeds up that timeline. It's a crystal ball scenario. We've had large projects through our facilities of 100,000 plus panels that may have only been in line for a few years due to a hail event or a hurricane, wind event, things of that nature. And then obviously you have some level of construction breakage, whether it's during the construction itself or the transportation from supplier to site, which generates panels hitting our recycling stream that are very new technology. So all that to be said, we're averaging about 11 years. That number will go back a little bit, with more life to it, maybe 14, 15 year average when some of the larger repowers in the country occur, where all of a sudden there's 1 million, 2 million panel projects that might have a higher life than the 11 years. So we do expect that number to drop a little bit, but we do not see it getting to the 25 and 30 year mark that's more or less advertised with this data. So yeah, if we take a look at this graph here, in 2024, between our three facilities, the major source of panels hitting them were construction breakage. You then have, weather events and just different reasons for R&M breakage, on site to get panels, with the repowers being a smaller percentage. But you fast forward, only 4 or 5 years from now, and you're going to start seeing repower really driving the panels that are hitting the recycling stream, which means it will be a little bit older technology, but you'll have more of a consistent supply, which will be very important as we get later in this discussion on why that is important to the U.S. supply chain. We've already began some projects that are $1 million+ panel repowers starting to come through our facility. So we're going to start seeing this graph and this data shift quite a bit in the coming years. So we need to talk a little bit about driving forces of what's for recycling demand in the United States. So one of the negative driving forces are, cost, right? So currently landfill disposal is going to be a bit cheaper, including transportation. You're seeing $2 to $5 a panel. There are some states that are starting to put legislation in on specifically what type of landfill they could go to. So some landfill costs, depending on the region or the type of landfill, could actually make that number a little bit higher. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Then you have incomplete recycling, and we'll discuss that in a little bit of depth later. But incomplete recycling, it could be anywhere from $0 to $8. And ultimately what that means is you have a recycler trying to get the low-hanging fruit, which is aluminum frame, only representing maybe about 10% of that composition, and the other 90% gets diverted to a landfill. So it's a bit of greenwashing, if you will. So those costs could be wildly erratic. And then you have true solar panel recycling, where we're actually doing the commodity separation, getting all the commodities back into a supply chain. Those costs have come down. That's a positive, but it still is higher than landfilling. A positive of the pricing, metric here is, so a lot of our clients that have been with us, utilities, energies, EPCs, for a few years now, they've seen major costs year over year. So even if they've already committed to recycling and not landfilling or incomplete recycling, now they have this driving force to go to different project managers, different, maybe opponents of burdening the recycling costs throughout the organization, and saying these are coming down year over year. We should really start building this into our costing structure. Reasons that costing is coming down, a lot of it has to do with technology advances. We have quite a bit of site visits throughout our different plants, and we always kind of joke, if you come today and then you come 6 to 12 months later, you're going to probably see a good change in the technology. It really is advancing that quickly, and we have a very large R&D side to our business. And then you have economies of scale. So to bring this back into supply chain a little bit, consumers of the generated commodities we are obtaining from the solar panels, a lot of times they're not going to get those contracts to consume it or change their manufacturing process to utilize recovered and recyclable commodities until they have this consistent supply. Once you start seeing more of these larger volumes, from SPR and other recyclers hitting the recycling stream, then you'll earn some more economies of scale. You'll get new supply chain markets that open up, which again will bring down cost. And then, I alluded to earlier, the transportation side in the US is much different. The EU market, you have the ability to really use rail a lot. You have the ability in a country to not go, quite a bit of kilometers in that sense. Whereas in the US, a lot of times that semi truck of solar panels getting in the recycling facility, the transportation side might be just as high as the recycling cost. So what we've done at SPR is we're popping up different regional facilities to really close that gap. Not only does it help our clients' ESG goals and carbon footprint, it's also drastically bringing down recycling costs. Some other positive forces towards recycling demand is policy and legislation, and the ASEA's leadership here in this space as the main association in the United States. So first and foremost, recycling side has been mostly bipartisan, believe it or not. Not something that's commonly discussed anymore in the US. It might be for wildly different reasons, but a lot of states are taking a hard look at, hey, this is a new waste stream. We have certain landfill capacity in our state representing our biggest populations. We want to make sure that these large projects aren't just filling up our landfills sooner. The North Carolina had its DEQ do an economic review commission to the legislature a few years ago. It was 2 Februarys ago. And they said, for example, the landfills representing the highest populations in North Carolina only have about a 10-year capacity. This is a new waste stream coming online. So both sides are very eager to get some sort of recycling legislation in place. The EPA has solar panels tagged as hazardous waste, but they have mentioned that it's going to transfer to universal waste classification. That was looking to occur this June of this year, but we've seen a bit of a delay to that. So if a state does not have a waste classification in place, it's hazardous unless proven otherwise. And then SEIA, the largest trade association here in the space, they're doing wonderful work here. For example, they're working on a recycling certification to help big asset owners and generators of these really understand who's actually recycling these. Some recent legislation that passed in Texas, it went into effect on the 1st of September in 2025. I see the 5s missing there. So it wasn't year 2, it was year 2025. HB Bill 3228. There's now a solar recycling mandate in the state. It was the first of its kind in the country. And then North Carolina had some legislation go into effect where there's a C&D landfill ban, and then recycling plans for 2 megawatt or larger developments, or even ones that are online, need to be submitted to the state by 2026. So landfilling is fairly explanatory, and we're going to talk about the technology that goes into true recycling, but there's some risks to the incomplete recycling, both to the supply chain and both to the generator. So it's important to briefly go over that. Again, what incomplete recycling is, and it occurs in a lot of new waste streams when there is some low-hanging fruit. And what we mean by that is a low percentage of the composition carries some positive value, and that's the aluminum frame in this setting. So what we're seeing starting to happen a little bit in the US ahead of regulations is incomplete recyclers going to market saying they're a recycler, and they're bringing in quite a bit of solar panels. They're able to offer unrealistic pricing, or maybe even free, because they're going to harvest the aluminum frame. But then what happens is 90% of the panel is just stockpiled somewhere. And that has obvious risks to the supply chain, because when it hits the recycling stream, the proper recycling stream, we could recover silicon and copper and silver and other metals and plastics. Whereas if they are just harvesting 10% of it and getting left behind, these are just going to be, more or less landfilled or just abandoned. And it's important for generators to recognize, generators in this sense being anyone that's an asset owner that has panels, that if this does occur, the United States has legislation, the federal Superfund, and what typically happens is a landlord, a collector of these materials that is recycled improperly, they go out of business, they disappear. A landlord goes to recoup their facility, they find this mess left behind. And what happens is the Superfund Act hits, and then the generator that actually supplied those panels, regardless of what they've paid or didn't pay to recycle, is now on the hook for that cleanup. So it's very important to mitigate risk when choosing a recycler and making sure that it actually is real recycling going on. SEIA is doing a wonderful job of creating the certification to maybe help lead the way in that. Here's an example of a warehouse in Houston that we were contacted about. Landlord said that the company disappeared. They're left with this mess, and they see about 600,000 pounds of solar panels with only the frame removed. A little bit of due diligence on that. First and foremost, if you're looking for a recycler, go visit their facility and make sure it's being done in-house. When you start outsourcing and saying that, a downstream vendor and another vendor and another vendor are handling it, it really loses that audibility, if you will. Make sure that they're currently recycling at scale right now. There's not a future plan. Hey, we have this idea that's going to happen in 2, 3, 4 years. These are all things that could kind of give you some level of protection. And then obviously, make them walk the walk, show bill of ladings, make sure that you see outbound glass shipments going to a consumer of glass, things of these nature. So true solar panel recycling and how it could feed the US supply chain. So the clean separation and recovery of the materials within the panel. It requires a good bit of technology. As you know, these are manufactured to withstand quite a bit of elements. So it's not that you're just screwing apart, different components and get to just cleanly break it apart. So you have glass, aluminum, silicon, plastic, and other metals. And true solar panel recycling is having technology to recover all of those cleanly. You cannot send glass to a glass consumer if it's mixed with aluminum and silicon and metals, for example. To obtain them, there's several different technologies. At SPR's facilities, we use thermal and mechanical technologies. You also will see some metallurgical where they'll recover some of the precious metals. Again, the higher purity, the more applications these could go into U.S. supply chain, which then brings down costs. And bringing this all back to the topic of the day, the supply chain. So, Keith had mentioned that, there's a lot of unknown and a lot of risks in tariffs, and he even mentioned copper specifically. So keeping panels from the landfills and incomplete recyclers, there's certain components that could already feed U.S. solar supply chain today, and those are going to be things like the aluminum frame, silver, and copper. We could recover those metals, and they could get reintroduced in the U.S. supply chain. Glass cullet and silicon are components in other U.S. manufacturing, but they are feeding the U.S. supply chain. There is recyclers that are starting to just partner, with maybe some overseas companies who they're processing, which might help bring costs down. But then these components are getting shipped offshore. But the challenge with the U.S. glass staying in the U.S. Solar manufacturing supply stream is most of the glass that's in the solar panels is going to have antimony in it. The U.S. market glass recycling companies that could take recycled glass cullet and turn it into new glass, they use float glass technology in the United States. It's much less energy intensive and it's more cost effective. The problem with that is antimony cannot work in a float glass technology. So again, as more clean glass cullet gets recovered from recycling and could enter the solar supply chain, then you might see glass manufacturers switch to a roll glass technology if they think that supply is there and start feeding the U.S. solar manufacturing from glass perspective. Contact information is there if anyone has any questions outside of this, but I will send it back over to Ryan.
Thanks, Brett. Really appreciate that presentation. So we have time for one or two questions here. And again, if you have any questions from the audience, feel free to submit them. One question is, as module designs continue to change and evolve, what's your strategy for ensuring that your advanced recycling process maintains a high material recovery rate and purity rates for the next generation of panels with, new formats like bifacial or frameless models? How do you sort of stay with the changing technology curve?
Yeah, you really just can't take your foot off the gas in terms of having R&D going on at all times, as well as having money to invest in those type of R&D and technologies. A little bit of the upside, but would be a huge negative side to anyone that's actually building out a solar project, is we do get to see some of this new technology pretty quickly because there's always that low percentage of breakage, what we talked about earlier, that will break either on the installation or the transportation. So we get these panels in, we get our hands on them, and we start looking at ways to accomplish that. We did see a huge influx of bifacial panels the last couple of years because construction breakage was a large part of our throughput. So we have already created a bifacial solution that's active in our North Carolina facility, and we hope to get one, equally, active in our other facilities. But that's really the answer to that, is that we're gonna have to keep investing in R&D and meeting with our engineers and equipment manufacturers.
Great, thank you. Now, since you mentioned the cost signals still for a lot of developers lead them to send panels to the landfill, what are some specific market mechanisms or policy incentives that you'd recommend maybe tax credits, state funds that could structurally shift developer behavior, support more recycling? And maybe are there any examples of like other nations that have successful programs?
Right. Yeah, it's a great question. So, tax credits and any type of state funding is obviously always very advantageous to help, cover some of those costs and close the gap. What we have seen already occur in the United States might be a little bit more of the heavy-handed way of doing it, where we see outright landfill bans, or what we have seen that you could consider, an incentive in a way, is we've had a lot of projects that at the local level or state level, when they are going in their planning stages to get permitted, have to submit a recycling plan or decommissioning plan. So a lot of, companies that have worked with us to help really put some good data behind that and some real costing. We've seen, their projects maybe go through and get approved a little bit more than some that don't put a lot of effort into that. So there is some incentive there. In other countries, we've seen, advanced recycling fees where panels are sold. It goes into some sort of, pot at the state level or the country level. So then that could help fund recycling, things of that nature. So I think those are a handful of the ways that you might be able to see help incentivize it. But then a lot of the onus is on us recyclers, right? We got to continuously bring down that cost and close that gap from, landfilling or incomplete recycling to actually doing it the correct way.
Thank you. Question from the audience here. There's a increased amount of panels beginning to hit the market that include a thin layer of perovskites in tandem with silicon. What's your view of the recyclability of perovskites, and are there challenges associated with that?
Yeah, so far that's been a very limited amount of panels that have hit our stream and really a lot of the recycling stream. So from a technology perspective, they could still go through the lines that we already have in place. So from that perspective, there's no challenges. What happens is anytime you separate commodities into different groups, glass, silicon, silver, tin, copper, you have to go get those lab tested for their purity. So when you're selling them back into a smelter or a refinery or a consumer of it, they need to know what's in it. So that's where a lot more of the research has to go on those type of technologies. We have to understand when you're adding different type of compositions to this mix, if you will, if now these generated commodities could actually go back into the supply chain that is already consuming them. So it really is, step one is finding a technology that can do it. Step two is getting the commodities separated and then getting them lab tested. And step three is working with your downstream, consumers of it and seeing if that new composition poses any problems.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Yeah, it looks like that's all we have for time now. Thanks so much, Brett, for your presentation today. I really appreciate you giving us the latest on recycling.
Yep. Thank you, Ryan.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye.
All right. So we're now going to take a 10-minute break. When we come back on the other side, we'll have our main panel with CEA, Anza, and REC Group. We'll talk about navigating the U.S. supply chain. So we'll see you back in 10 minutes, about 1:10 Eastern Time. See you soon. Welcome back, everyone, to PV Magazine USA Week, Day 2 here, navigating the U.S. supply chain. Before we get started with our main panel here, we just wanted to open up a poll question to the audience. If you were with us yesterday, this may look familiar to you. The same question as yesterday, but I think it informs this discussion in an effective way. So the question is, which of the following has presented the greatest challenge for your business? Is it the expiring investment tax credits, foreign entity of concern or FEOC restrictions, cuts to federal funding and obstruction from agencies, DOE funding cuts, Solar for All cuts, EPA, or D would be tariffs, including reciprocal tariffs, AD/CVD, and more. So we'll wait a moment for some responses to roll in. All right, looks like right now the leading responses are split between the expiring investment tax credits. We're losing those about 5 years ahead of when we expected to. And then tariffs are also a leading issue. As Keith was saying before, you go to bed with one tariff rate and wake up with something else. So not only is the cost of tariffs difficult, but just the uncertainty and the business planning that becomes obstructed by that is causing a lot of challenges. Great. So thanks for your responses there. We'll go ahead and now move to our main panel discussion, navigating the U.S. supply chain. Our panel has a nice diverse background here. We have the buyer's perspective with Mike Hall of Anza, deep market and trade intelligence with Joseph Johnson of Intertek CEA, and the position of a major global manufacturer navigating U.S. policy with Brian Lynch and REC Group. Our three panelists are going to discuss the push to increase U.S. manufacturing, navigating challenges like FEOC and AD/CVD, tariffs, and more. And viewers will walk away from this session today with a better picture of the overall solar component supply landscape. So I'm pleased to welcome today's panel. First, I'd like to introduce Mike Hall. Mike Hall is the CEO and board member at Anza. He began his 21-year career in renewable energy by co-founding Borrego in 2002, where he was CEO from 2009 to 2023. At Borrego, he oversaw the growth of a leading solar storage and distributed wind developer, now known as New Leaf Energy. Mike co-developed the Anza business strategy in 2020 to address supply chain challenges for IPP customers. He's dedicated to helping the solar and storage industry achieve superior project outcomes, and he holds an MS in chemical engineering from Stanford. Thanks for joining us today, Mike.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Thank you. We're also joined by Joseph Johnson. Joseph has over 5 years in the solar and energy storage industry and more than 7 years of experience in data analysis roles and in providing valuable insight into a range of trade-related issues facing the solar industry. Joseph also stays at the forefront of emerging policy changes, and he's committed to helping ensure clients receive the latest supplier and industry insights by curating CEA's supplier intelligence offerings. Thanks for joining us, Joseph.
Thanks for having me, Ryan.
And finally, we're joined by Brian Lynch. Brian Lynch leads strategy and business development for REC Americas with a focus on policy. Brian joined REC after 2 decades of industry experience working for leading companies in the space. During his tenure in the industry, Brian has been involved in over 1 gigawatt of transactions. He lives in Rochester, New York, where he's an active volunteer and tireless advocate for the solar industry. Thank you for joining us today, Brian.
Appreciate it, Ryan. Thanks for inviting me.
Great. So we'll open up the discussion here. A lot of different themes to touch on. I think I'd like to start with U.S. manufacturing. SEIA just released a report today that the U.S. now has active manufacturing capacity in each leg of the supply chain, all the way from polysilicon refinement to module assembly. But the upstream early legs of the supply chain still have low volumes. So for Joseph, do you foresee the U.S. continuing to close the supply chain gaps? And what kind of market conditions are needed to support more of the upstream domestic manufacturing?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Ryan. So upstream, at least to the cell level, we already have a great deal of interest in building manufacturing. There's a lot of factories under active construction. We see those facilities as incredibly likely to come online. But as you go from cell up to ingot and wafer and then up to polysilicon, it really becomes more challenging to get more capacity outside of what is already under active construction. If you just think about some of the more recent FEOC provisions, as Keith pointed out, a lot of them include technology restrictions on the partners you can work with, and a lot of the leading cutting edge technology just comes from China. So if you can't use Chinese partners, who's going to be able to really help ramp these US manufacturing entities? And a lot of the value of these upstream facilities really depend on things like how long 45X is going to be around for on the subsidy side, how long domestic content is going to be around for on the ITC and PTC side, on the buy side, and all of those have a shelf life. So if you're a manufacturer that hasn't started pouring concrete today, you're building into a loss of incentives on the supplier side, on the buy side, and you're also potentially building into a little bit of a market downturn as the ITC and PTC continue to phase out of developer safe harbor pipelines. So it's really struggling to get these upstream facilities, not to mention the time it takes to build a new polysilicon or ingot wafer factory. You look at the history of those facilities in the US, it's a long lead time. So there are just challenges, a lot of bright opportunity on the cell, but we would caution probably the audience to expect a pretty dramatic build out of anything, from wafer and polysilicon beyond what has already been started.
Thank you. And building on that, Brian, what are some of the top strategic factories that are currently challenging or delaying a decision to commit substantial capital to build out a full stack ingot wafer cell manufacturing in the U.S. beyond module assembly? What are some sort of roadblocks to establishing that?
Yeah, I think whether you're a manufacturer or downstream, like Mike and the team at Anza, you just need confidence, right? These are all high capex projects that require returns of investment that are predicated potentially on incentives, because you have to think about this in the context of the global economy. And so, as Joseph pointed out, China's done a great job with strong industrial policy over the last 2 decades, heads down commit to dominate the space, and now to try and reassure that if we want to do that, if we're serious about that as a country, then we need to create confidence so the private industries can invest in this. These are multi-year investments, and I think the current administration is really trying to take a stick-based approach with tariffs. And the reality is those are, we've seen this industry, if you've been in solar for more than a decade, we've been dealing with AD/CVD cases and 201 tariffs and 301 tariffs, and we can go through the whole litany of tariffs. There's usually a way around that. And so what you need is a balanced approach of carrots and sticks. And the IRA attempted to provide the carrot element to it, but it really wasn't effectively enforced for long enough. Yes, the manufacturing incentives stick around for some time, but to greenfield a new project that's anything beyond module capacity, you really don't have enough of a window. And the sticks, unfortunately, aren't long enough to or big enough to encourage that investment to be made. The final point I'll make is with the FEOC implications entering the market effective January 1st, the reality is that just excludes you from achieving the tax credit. Well, sooner or later, the tax credits go away depending on your safe harbor strategies. If you don't have the carrot of the tax credit, then sourcing product as cost efficiently as possible is going to be the the dominant strategy, and that probably means you don't need to source from the U.S.
Thank you. And building on that, for Mike, how do you evaluate the long-term viability and risk profile of new domestic module manufacturing entrants that are heavily reliant on the longevity of 45X? And what factors beyond just price are now critical for qualifying a new supplier?
Yeah, so there's a lot of diligence that we help our IPP and developer customers navigate with regards to, first, the counterparty broadly, the company that they're going to be contracting with, but also how much risk there is in an individual procurement that for domestic content is often relying on a factory that may not be at full production yet. So, that's looking at the company itself, what their track record is, what their financing looks like if it's a relatively new company, but then also actually looking at the factory build out itself. We've definitely seen manufacturers, not just in the US, also as manufacturers have shifted locations to avoid AD/CVD, overstate how far along they are with regards to capacity buildouts. So those are things we look at. If you're looking at long-term viability of U.S. manufacturers, I think we've started with, Brian and Joe have hit on a lot of the main things. I mean, they are reliant on the carrot and sticks. There's the 45X credit, and can these manufacturers qualify for it given the FEOC restrictions? But there is also the additional carrot of the tax credit adder, the domestic content adder. And what we see, we collect more pricing data than anyone else in the market, is that in general, there's about a 50% price gap between buying US modules with US cells as compared to imported modules with imported cells. And that price gap generally exists only because of the tax value, the tax credit adder. So if the tax credit is expiring sooner, that is definitely a threat to the business model of domestic manufacturing.
Thank you. Now let's move on to some more trade-related issues: FEOC, UFLPA, AD/CVD. For Joseph, could you outline the fundamental difference in the due diligence process required to comply with FEOC versus UFLPA, and which currently poses a greater risk for operational bottlenecks for imports?
I mean, I think Keith summed it up very eloquently when he said there's just no real guidance for FEOC right now. So that is going to be a huge bottleneck for the industry as everyone is rushing to prepare for FEOC. But the exact rules and definitions and mechanisms, some of those details have just yet to be released. Whereas with something like UFLPA, this has been around for years now. The audit process is pretty well understood. There are, of course, some buyers and suppliers that might forgo that process and may get jammed later, but it is at least very much internalized by the industry, and there's a solid set of principles to operate on. Now, luckily for the industry, there are a lot of similarities between auditing for UFLPA and auditing for FEOC. The focus is, of course, different. On UFLPA, you're really following silicon, and you're chasing silicon from every node of the supply chain, from module, potentially all the way back up to the ports. Whereas for FEOC, you're just looking at that potentially module node if you're a module buyer, or cell node if you're a module manufacturer trying to vet your cell supplier. But then you have to really branch out and look at every material that goes into that module and goes into the cell. So FEOC can be very broad and extraordinarily broad, which is difficult. Whereas UFLPA, the difficulty lies in how you can get access to upstream partners and upstream manufacturing nodes that might not be all integrated together into one facility. So they each have their challenges. But luckily, some of the shared infrastructure that started with UFLPA traceability, a lot of that can carry over to FEOC, which is what we are seeing in a lot of our audits right now. As we go into these factories and we start looking at the FEOC side of the equation, a lot of the paperwork all starts to be familiar, although we're categorizing it in a quite a different manner.
Thank you. And Brian, could you talk a little bit about REC's positioning in the market here and what your company's experience has been like navigating UFLPA, which has been around for a while, FEOC, and what vetting supply chains looks like?
Yeah. I think if you've been importing modules at any volume over the last few years, you've received a notice from customs as it relates to UFLPA. And so as Joseph flagged, there's a relatively good infrastructure and system in place where you've been through this and you understand what documentation needs to be provided. As long as you're sourcing poly from a non-Chinese supplier, that's a relatively tried and true exercise that customs will periodically spot audit, and they've also become accustomed on their side on what a vendor can produce and what's within the realm of possibility, given the complexities of the global supply chain. Where I'd say, UFLPA is becoming more top of mind is, when it first came out, there was a shortage of modules in the market, and so any detainment could cause massive delays in projects, and so it was very acutely felt. Then we had a surplus of modules that are in the market during the Biden tariff moratorium. And now, as we enter safe harbor cycles and we see a lot of the safe harbor product, stockpiled product, disappear for one reason or another, now stoppages are becoming more acute. And so it's UFLPA never went away. It's just being felt differently by the downstream. On the FEOC side, again, I'll echo what Joseph said and what Keith said. This is a new world. And so the ambiguity of the rules are challenging. And so I've rationalized that there's effectively three buckets of suppliers. There's the clearly non-Chinese, First Solar, Hanwha, REC. There's the gray area ones. Maybe their US entities have navigated this. Maybe they haven't. They represent risk, but not overt risk. And then there's the clearly Chinese companies that are maybe overtly saying, yeah, they're not going to get through it, or they will shape-shift their US entities and possibly on the other side. As someone who represents a company that's non-Chinese owned, has no Chinese debt, we still have challenges, right? I spend 90% of every day working with lawyers and accounting firms trying to produce a document that would give our downstream buyers the confidence that we are who we say we are. And the reality is the infrastructure on their side hasn't been developed yet either. So we're all racing towards these deadlines at the end of the year. And then again, for July, for the safe harbor deadline, we will get there. But the ambiguity of the rules aren't giving anyone sufficient confidence to say, here's the binary document. Yes, you are compliant, or no, you're not. Or to what degree are you compliant or not on the material systems side? That represents risk, and risk gums up these projects and creates challenges for the seller and the buyer.
Thanks. And I'll open this next question first to Mike, and then maybe Joseph can follow on. Some of the costs associated with navigating UFLPA documentation, AD/CVD legal exposure, FEOC compliance, the cost can be substantial. How should solar developers, in collaboration with their intelligence partners, quantify and budget for this compliance risk as a component of the project's CapEx or LCOE rather than sort of an unpredictable soft cost? How do you price it in?
Yeah, I mean, maybe before I answer that directly, just a couple of comments on FEOC for solar broadly, and I think it's very different if we're talking about storage, and I think you see this in the poll results. I think the talk about FEOC and the perceived threat of FEOC actually might be greater than the actual, just because of the timing. So there's a massive amount of multiple years of projects have been safe harbored. I don't know that anyone knows the exact number. I mean, I've heard 150 gigawatts thrown out. I think we believe it's actually more than that. So multiple years of projects already safe harbored. Those projects do not need to comply with FEOC. So then we have 6 months between the end of this year-ish and when the next safe harbor deadline is. And for projects that are trying to safe harbor in the first half of next year, they will need to comply with FEOC. But once you hit July, the timeline to complete is going to be so tight that we just don't think there's going to be a lot of projects that are going to post July be starting, at least for the utility scale market. And so it is an issue. However, I think what we're going to see is tens and potentially even hundreds of gigawatts of projects still buying FEOC modules because of their safe harbor status. So I just wanted to state that because I think sometimes that gets lost in the conversation around FEOC. It's a tough question, the one around costs. We do see it mostly as a soft cost and a risk issue, the risks of UFLPA and managing AD/CVD. And for UFLPA, we really encourage our clients, developers, and IPPs primarily to diligence the counterparty's experience with UFLPA and UFLPA detainments. That's a big part of the value add that we bring, is looking at not just where is their poly coming from, but also have they gotten through a detainment before and what did that look like? Because if they've gotten through it once before, they're more likely to be able to get through it quickly again. And then with AD/CVD, it's navigating the next duties, whether it's a new petition or even the implementation of duties from an existing petition, and how do you navigate that contractually and mitigate your risk with the counterparty. It's mostly soft costs and risk mitigation rather than a whole lot of hard costs.
Thanks. Anything to add, Joseph?
I would only add in that, really when you're looking at budgeting for this, it's hard to say that you kind of can't afford it. Because if you look at the alternative for what these audits guard against, if you're looking at a UFLPA audit or to prove that there's no Xinjiang polysilicon or forced labor in your supply chains, if you don't do the audit and your product gets detained and it's detained for multiple weeks or multiple months, the liquidated damages for your project really start to pile up. So one missed delivery can translate into millions and millions of extra dollars by not having panels at your site, and then potential delays and damages down the road from that. So there's significant risk on the UFLPA side of, again, not going through the audit process. And then the same thing from FEOC. If you think about the value of the ITC or PTC, that could all be lost if, at the end of the day, you are starting your project January 1st, 2026, and you're subject to the new FEOC rules, and you're expecting to get, X millions of dollars from, an ITC or PTC payout, and then that is removed because you were found not to be in compliance with the new FEOC rules. So the budgeting has to be done because, again, the losses or the risk on the downside can be significant for developers.
Thank you. Now for Brian, you mentioned your company is not very UFLPA exposed, but for a manufacturer, how much does the need to create a UFLPA compliant, fully documented supply chain add to the cost per watt of a module that's entering the U.S. market?
It's really just the burden of the non-Chinese poly versus Chinese poly. So if you track the spot pricing through CEA or IHS or any of the market intel, you can pretty clearly understand the price delta between traceable non-Chinese poly and Chinese poly. It's roughly 3 or 4 cents in a finished good module, depending on the wattage and the various things that go into it. So there is a real cost burden, right? There's an economic imperative to try and minimize costs as much as possible while maintaining compliance. And we've certainly seen folks maybe push the envelope a little bit too far on that. I want to just piggyback on something that Joseph and Mike said. For my 2 decades in the industry, it's really been about cost out, right? Cost out opens up TAM and enables more projects to be built. And I think we were in a cycle where that was prudent. As it stands today, and I define today as being post OB3, it should be about risk mitigation. Get the projects built and maybe don't optimize for every penny and every nickel, optimize for constructability, which means de-risking. And And so Mike made a great comment about, hey, the window for FEOC is actually kind of small. It's like 6 months. With that being said, I spent a lot of time on the Hill in the run up to the OB3. And what I heard time and time again from Republican legislators is there's a perception, whether right or wrong, I'm not going to discuss that or argue it. There's a perception that U.S. tax credits are going to support Chinese companies. They wanted to stop that. And so with this forthcoming FEOC guidance, there's a scenario where they could retroactively preclude tax credit monetization for Chinese companies and projects that use components from Chinese companies. Now, again, this represents an element of risk, and I think we're seeing the downstream buyers quantify and manage that risk in different ways. It's not a known thing. We haven't seen them do anything retroactively, but as the industry is really rushing towards gamification and exploiting loopholes, I think everyone just needs to be cognizant of we still don't know the final rules, and therefore risk mitigation should be a consideration relative to cost and procurement optimization.
Thank you. And for Joseph, when performing supplier intelligence, what's an important or possibly an overlooked data point or metrics that developers should be demanding from their manufacturing partners to prove supply chain integrity and material to reduce their risk to trade-related detentions or non-compliance penalties?
I think probably one of the best data points we look at is what is available by import records. Right now, the status of U.S. factories are of key importance to a lot of developers. I believe, Mike pointed out, sometimes the supplier will claim their factory is, further ahead than it actually is. But a lot of times you could just see, hey, look, do you already have equipment? Are you buying, basic construction materials on like some of those introduction stages to a manufacturing line? And all that comes in over source. A lot of it is, publicly accessible through CBP or other customs aggregators. Generally you can go through a third party to say, hey, does this pass the sniff test? And you should also, ask your supplier. It's like, hey, look, can you show me that you've actually paid for your equipment? Can you show me who you contracted with to provide, the finishing line for your product or, another stage in your manufacturing process? And if they can say, hey, look, we can produce the results, they may not tell you the price that they paid for that equipment, but they should be able to say, hey, look, the equipment's here, it's in shorts, it's installed, or it's undergoing installation. A lot of that they can provide the documentation for as well. Obviously, the best thing to do is a site inspection. A lot of U.S. suppliers right now are offering factory walkthroughs for their partner buyers, so that the buyer has the confidence that, hey, look, there's a line getting built. Maybe it's not operational, but you're at least where you say you are, and that is pretty key given how many delays we've seen some factories run into, whereas other factories are seemingly making really good progress. You just want to be really sure where your supplier stands, again, because it goes back to delays, and delays can be multi-million dollars if not managed correctly, or if the supplier doesn't alert you with a good amount of lead time for you to make alternative preparations.
Thank you. And staying with Joseph here, talking about AD/CVD. So new petitions have been filed against India, Indonesia, and Laos. And it seems like it's almost like a game of whack-a-mole where it keeps getting applied to more and more nations and supply chains keep getting moved. Based on your market intelligence, are there any, key criteria to look for to predict, what nation might be targeted next in an investigation, and how can buyers proactively source around this kind of risk of new investigations launching in more nations?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, no one will know who's going to be in Solar 5 or when Solar 5 might fall. But if you look at Solar 3 to Solar 4, it was all about time to market. Indonesia, Laos, they were very close to existing Southeast Asian facilities. Equipment could be moved, personnel could be moved. And so Solar 5 countries are likely going to depend or be those nations which are the fastest time to be supplying the U.S. with product. So right now, that would include markets like Turkey, which have existing manufacturing infrastructure. the Philippines, which is also right next door to many other Southeast Asian factories where equipment can be moved, or those facilities or those locations that are being focused on as being a little bit further afield. A lot of build out is going on in Egypt to be ready very soon. Same thing in Ethiopia. So suppliers are moving further afield and diversifying, but there's likely to be another crop of cell supply really coming online as Solar 4 really starts to bite the market. Companies, again, they're becoming a little bit more smaller, less concentrated in a grouping of nations, but there is still great risk that with all the downturn in Southeast Asia, any new source of supply is just really going to shine as, hey, look, all the product right now is coming from country X or country Y, and is likely to get a lot of scrutiny.
Thanks. I'll open this next question to the whole panel. Maybe we can start with Mike. How does this perpetual state of tariff uncertainty affect long-term procurement strategies and contracting? Specifically, is the industry seeing a move away from longer-term PPAs that rely on imported modules, or are developers starting to shift risk entirely to suppliers through fixed price and duty-inclusive contracts?
Yeah, it's a great question. And at a high level, a lot of what we do are help large IPPs become more nimble with regards to procurement. We're generally pushing our clients to move away from large multi-year framework agreements because there's so much change in the market with regards to trade, but also technology and supply chains. And so what we're usually doing is to try and help IPs and developers perpetually look at the entire market, all of their supply options, and then overlay their needs with regards to technology, commercial risk, their tolerances around counterparty, and then do contracts on a project specific basis rather than what we saw a few years ago, which was a whole lot of like gigawatt scale deals. We also, the data shows that there isn't a lot of economic benefit once you get beyond a couple hundred megawatts with regards to economies of scale. There isn't a consistent price signal from the manufacturers that say, hey, if you buy a gigawatt over multi-years, that's actually a better economic proposition than buying per project. So that's a big part of what we do, is try and make buyers more nimble. And then with regards to risk, no, we don't see a lot of examples where you can put all of the risk of, what Trump decides when he wakes up in the morning on tariffs or the next AD/CVD 5, that you can push all that onto the manufacturers. It's not logical. There are things you can do. The best kind of like our standard is to try and help get a termination option for the buyer if there's a big additional tariff or duty that they can't handle. Maybe you can get the supplier to take some amount of that risk, but certainly not all of it. And then there are some instances where there's either inventory or the supplier's already committed to manufacturing a product that they don't have a home for, we can get them to take even more risk. But generally, they're not taking it all.
Thanks. And Brian, could you add on that? What is the supplier perspective of how ongoing uncertainty is sort of shaping contract terms?
Yeah, I think it really depends on who's buying and what their goal is. I agree with what Mike said that, everyone thought that there was this notion that if you bought a gigawatt, you could unlock this new price tier. And maybe that was accurate, but right, you go to the financials of the 4 or 6 largest Chinese companies in the first 6 months of the year, they lost $1.5 billion, right? So at some point, asking your vendor to lose more money, it's not a great long-term strategy. And I think the market's kind of waking up to this. We're a unique bubble in the US as it relates to solar and procurement. And again, it's going to be dependent on the strategy. Today, if you're safe harboring or commencing construction on a project and you have a 2 to 4 year horizon to complete that project, then maybe the notion changes that, yeah, you do want to find a reliable supplier that you have confidence in from a FEOC standpoint, from a manufacturing footprint standpoint, that will help you minimize the risk of tariff. The reality is no one is going to be completely risk-free that has available capacity. So it's all about intelligent procurement and de-risking. And again, everyone's strategy and comfort level and price tolerance for that is going to be a little bit different. On the AD/CVD stuff, right, there's a couple interesting things happening. There's a legal challenge to the determination of the Solar 3 rates. Those were the first AD/CVD cases that considered transnational subsidization. That was a big driver in some of the high rates. And if the appeal or if the court case determines that the calculation was improper on the AD/CVD for Solar 3, that likely changes the math for those 4 countries, Cambodia, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, as well as the new case, which is Indonesia, Laos, and India. The interesting thing is, I can't speak for the petitioners. REC is not involved in this. The Solar 3 case and 2/3 of the Solar 4 case were aimed at Chinese companies that were circumventing the duties or seemed like they were circumventing the duties, and they were just moving the factories as we've talked about. India, however, is a new challenge because there are not Chinese companies operating within India. Now, we did see there's a customs thing with Huawei using Chinese cells and bringing them to the U.S. with false declarations. But we've almost entered a new frontier of the AD/CVD cases where the petitioners aren't targeting Chinese companies, they're targeting importers. And I think there's a strategic question we should be asking ourselves as an industry. If we decide, and again, I'm not going to weigh on this personally, do we want to have access to Chinese suppliers, or do we want to create a non-Chinese supply chain? If the answer is we want somewhat of a non-Chinese supply chain, maybe to de-risk having one country control, is it right to be roping in countries that don't have Chinese influence in the supply chain? Because now it's an us versus everybody else, and the U.S. will never win that game. And so I think we've entered a new frontier in the trade cases. I'm very curious what the preliminary rates end up being once the government reopens and those get published. But again, there's a lot of dynamics on the AD/CVD side that I think go beyond just straight cost, which we should all be mindful of, but it's more of a geopolitical question, a strategic question of where are we going as an industry from a supply chain perspective.
Thank you. Now, kind of going back upstream a little bit with the supply chain and talking about the wafer and cell gap. For Joseph, where in the world are developers and manufacturers finding the most reliable and policy compliant sources for wafers and cells that are not currently implicated by current or anticipated trade restrictions? And what kind of pricing premium does that kind of product command?
So right now, I think every import is subject to some sort of trade barrier. So you're never going to be completely safe unless you're buying 100% domestic. So there's not much there, but most buyers are still buying cells and wafers from really established wafer makers in Southeast Asia and directly from China still. We've definitely seen the Chinese imports of wafers and wafer provisions drop off, but a lot of the mature wafer supply is owned by Chinese manufacturers in Vietnam, Malaysia, and Thailand. Now, we have more recently seen a pivot, obviously with FEOC being revealed for several months now, to getting wafers from Laos and Indonesia. There's more local entities, at least in name, that are set up there, that are now providing more of the wafers to U.S. cell factories, but there's only really 2 operational U.S. cell factories that are at any significant scale, so those volumes are still small. Most of the product that is going into overseas products is all going to be, again, established Southeast Asian wafer suppliers. Where do we see that moving in the future? So wafers, if we're talking about those specifically, there's not an AD/CVD, there's just tariffs. Tariffs are at least calculable. You know the rates, generally they don't change that often. So you can at least say, okay, this is a source of wafers for now, and it's likely to remain that way as long as you can do the FEOC versus non-FEOC due diligence. Cells are obviously going to be the more difficult part because with the AD/CVD, that adds in retroactive tariffs, so nobody knows the rates. Those rates will change every year as well, which is a huge burden for any party that wants to assume the risk of using those cells. And so there is, again, very much moving into those 4 nations I listed earlier. and there's likely to be additional sources brought online into the future. Again, pre-anticipating Solar 5. Most manufacturers right now, though, are not rushing to build new capacity because there's the impending polysilicon 232 case, and most manufacturers at least want to know, is it even worthwhile to keep building in various countries? Are there any countries that will be treated differently or allocated quotas? Or what will the rates be? Does it even matter to build a new supplier? Can I keep using existing factories? So right now, there's a pretty big slowdown in any sort of activity, but most stuff still comes from the usual suspects right now.
Thanks. Yeah, we actually just had an audience question about 232 there. Could you just explain what 232 is and what kind of risk it poses for the market, and sort of if we're expecting any movement anytime soon in Washington of updates on 232?
So certainly there is a maximum timeline for 232 cases, but there's been a suite of those cases announced within the last couple months. They've all taken variable amounts of time to result in a report that's sent to the president, and then the president acting or creating a tariff based off of that report. I think our base case right now is sometime around December or January. So there's still about 1 to 2 months until a decision is likely to be rendered, but it could, of course, be sooner or later. And the key concern for the market is that the polysilicon 232 is product specific, not country specific, like a lot of the current tariffs and duties. So this could impact polysilicon as well as, well, it will impact polysilicon, but it's also unknown what types of derivatives it will impact. Will it impact wafers or cells all the way to modules? That could all be in scope. Also, the valuation of the tariff and the tariff structure can be quite different. It could be percentage based. It could be just a flat rate based off a couple of proposals. And given how much variability there is specifically around this 232, when it comes and what the values or impact will be, and also what exclusions might be put in place, most buyers are either trying to get product in before the 232 is likely, or waiting to see what the impact will be before resuming normal procurement activities or resuming manufacturing expansion plans.
Thank you. Now, I think we touched on this a little bit, but for Mike, just looking at like standardization versus flexibility, is there a trend among buyers to move towards standardizing on fewer, more compliant module types to simplify their due diligence, or are they maintaining a highly flexible supplier list and chasing the best current pricing?
I think what Brian said is definitely true, which is that over the last few years, it's the dynamics have changed from one that's really price focused to like price being the top priority for the buyer to risk and risk mitigation now being the top priority, and price being a concern, but secondary to am I going to get this stuff and what price risk do I have? What risk of delivery? What risk of price? Another thing that we've been trying to educate the market on is going beyond price and going to value-based pricing and taking into account what is an extra fraction of a point on efficiency worth to you? What is a larger form factor module, or a module that sits on the tracker, with strings better, or sits on the tracker without a customized clamp? What is that worth? Like First Solar being the obvious example of, if you compare dollars per watt of First Solar relative to, a TopCon or a Mono PERC, and you just look at the price, you're not capturing the whole value equation. There's a massive difference in value once you take into account those other factors. With regards to standardization, there's a tension. Buyers generally want to go back to who they've worked with before and who they trust. However, so much is changing that we're usually pushing buyers to consider new suppliers and a larger group of suppliers, and to try and stay as dynamic as possible. We think in today's market, that's what you have to do. if you're just like, I'm just going to go back to the same company and people that I worked with last year, and only mild, kind of soft test the market, you're probably leaving a lot of value and risk mitigation on the table.
Thanks. And anyone on the panel can address this. Part of what's driven solar's transition along, a huge part of it is that costs and prices have fallen so precipitously over the years. How far can that go? Can costs and prices keep going down, and especially with all of the cost of compliance pushing things up a little bit? Are we going to see sort of a bottom floor, or where do you see the pricing arc go, coming into the future?
I unmuted, so I'll go first, but I'm of course very curious to hear Mike's and Joseph's response to this. Key said something very interesting in the keynote. People are repricing projects almost real time as new tariffs and new complications come in, and they're finding acceptance on a project value level is a very interesting dynamic. Wholesale and retail pricing is growing rapidly, and that's one of the big artifacts of the OB3 that people aren't talking about. I think something like 80% of new utility scale generation capacity in the queue was associated with wind and solar. If we assume that 50% of that attrits out, what's the implication of that? It's increased wholesale and retail delivery charges, which ultimately make the economics for solar and wind attractive in a post-tax credit environment. So of course, lower cost equal greater TAM, greater margin. But at the end of the day, think about my point from 10 minutes ago about the largest suppliers losing $1.5 billion in the first 6 months. That's not sustainable. What we need to do is normalize where everyone involved in a project, whether you're a key supplier, a labor component, and don't discount the cost of labor now for construction with the current policy environment, to the developers and the ultimate equity holders in the projects. Everyone needs to make their fair share in the project and normalize on that versus just this relentless race to the bottom, because I think we're hitting an inflection point where the projects and the end consumers that we serve as an IPP or however the project is being utilized don't demand 2 cents per kilowatt hour power.
Yeah, I think that's a big driver of why the market should actually be able to pay more, is that the demand for energy and the price of energy is just skyrocketing, unlike any other time in my 20 plus years in power. There is theoretically prices in the US could be way lower than they are. I mean, if you go to Europe or anywhere where they don't have as many trade frictions, they're paying, less than half of what we're paying. But it's hard to, I don't think anyone is predicting that these duties, tariffs, and other trade restrictions are going to go away. So, I mean, we've since the beginning of the year seen, since like Q2, seen a stabilization and even slight increase in pricing in the US market. And we're not forecasting price drops given all the things we've been talking about, this hour. And then we also like demand, like we're talking about, the demand for the power is there. So theoretically, we could be paying a lot less. It's just hard to see a near or even medium term future where we are.
And just to tack onto that, certainly the near and medium term is dominated by just what's going on the trade barrier fronts and how that's impacting pricing. But there is going to be a U.S. market potentially end of decade that doesn't have buy-side incentives, but still has supply-side incentives. So there could very well be price declines as we get projects without ITC and PTC support that have to offer a little bit more of a suppliers that have to offer a little bit more of a rational module prices. As Mike said, module prices in the rest of the world are around 10 cents right now. Obviously, as Brian pointed out, companies in China are losing money at that price point, but there is kind of a natural balance around that where, again, the U.S. has its own trade barrier ecosystem, but U.S. prices could be lower, and likely as some of these incentives disappear, at least on the buy side, we will start to see some trend down, depending on, of course, how the kind of tariff and duty front continues to develop.
Thank you. Now, for Brian, what are you seeing on the tech side of things? Any trends with cell types, module formats? What's the latest with that?
Yeah, so REC standardized on a G12 heterojunction format a few years ago, which, whether right or wrong, that's what we chose to standardize on. I think there's performance attributions, there's cost kind of elements that drive that, and so it's certainly not a wrong pick. Where's interesting is subsequent to that decision, we've seen all sorts of litigation related to patent infringement claims on TopCon, and so heterojunction is this weird little animal that sits off to the side that isn't entangled in this IP litigation. There's certainly a lot of development in perovskites and 4T tandem products. That will be the new frontier. They are being commercialized to some degree. There's a stabilization, there's a cost efficacy, there's a market acceptance question on perovskites. But that is the next evolution that we will see as an industry before the end of the decade, maybe earlier. Again, we'll be a little bit late in the US due to the trade restrictions, but perovskites will be able to produce more power within the existing CapEx that's already been created with these projects, or with the factories to build these projects. The other interesting thing is I want to talk about domestic content for a second. So we really haven't talked about this on this panel. Right now, I'd say a lot of the manufacturers that are operating in the US are focused on strategic sourcing to either enable domestic content and or get around FEOC. And this is creating an interesting scenario where you're now, as a manufacturer, as an OEM, being forced or encouraged to look at suppliers that you others wouldn't look at. And so now it's, okay, well, I can deliver you your X% domestic content module, but there's a higher risk that module catches on fire. What would you like, downstream buyer? And so now we have this really interesting quirk of policy where OEMs are being encouraged to deliver product that may not be the product that they want to deliver to market. And this is, I think, an interesting phenomenon that we're just now realizing in the US. And so the takeaway there is for the downstream buyers, for the quality assurance folks is, again, what's best? Is it the 25-year life of the project, or is it maximizing the tax credit? Understanding the different stakeholders in the project will all have different viewpoints and values, and will exert their pressure, their influence where they can to monetize their segment at the greatest degree. But it's a risky strategy that I think people are just now waking up to.
Thanks. Mike, what are you seeing on the buyer side with that? Different technology types? Are there specific cell types that you're seeing demand trends increase for? And how does that look like on a distributed scale versus utility scale buyers?
Yeah, it's interesting. I would say a year ago, we were almost entirely helping buyers procure TopCon. And now we're actually seeing more PERC in the market. Some of it, I think, because of the amount of domestic manufacturing that's with PERC. We do help buyers look at HJT. Certainly part of what we do is help buyers quantify the advantage of a technology like HJT. Like, what is that actually worth to them? But Brian's making HJT, but there's not a lot in the market. So we just don't see a lot of those deals. Perovskites, lots of talk, no deals happening yet. And then First Solar's got significant market share for sure. And they're their own thing.
And then how about that domestic content adder piece? Are you seeing that as meaningfully changing decisions for buyers?
Yes. I would say it's about a third among buyers. There's a third who come into a procurement really focused on domestic content. They want to get that adder. And it's one of the things that's in developers know this, if they're developers listening, but people who aren't developers might not realize it, that the adder is not worth the same to everybody because of the way the basis is calculated. So if you're doing a community solar project with a really high PPA rate and a high CapEx, that adder actually might be worth more than a really large utility scale project with lower capex and a lower revenue contract. So we see about a third of buyers just really focused on domestic content, and that's actually what they want us to help them with, is how do I get there? A third who are trying to decide whether or not to do it, and then a third who have just decided, you know what, it's not worth it. It's too hard. It's too much. It's too expensive, and all of the soft costs I have associated with compliance and proving out, I'm worthy of the adder, or that I qualify for the adder, isn't worth it.
Thank you. So we've talked a lot about the solar supply chain here, but I wanted to talk a little bit about battery energy storage as well. For Joseph, among all of these trade barriers that we've seen, FEOC, AD/CVD, tariffs, which one of these has a more of an outsized risk for storage specifically? And could you talk about both importing and manufacturing in the U.S.?
I mean, definitely FEOC has a lot of risk because it's so new and no one quite knows what is that hard red line about where do I need to be across to be safe. And because a lot of the most mature battery material suppliers, whether it's the cell or the upstream material, are all going to be Chinese. So there are, of course, Korean and Japanese providers. There's more facilities being set up in Southeast Asia, but a lot of them have, again, Chinese materials somewhere in their supply chains. If you're direct procure of those Chinese materials or from a product from a Chinese company, that could run a pretty big risk. So FEOC, the bigger risk, just because many companies are still figuring it out. However, on the traceability requirements, to prove that there's not forced labor, the materials involved in battery storage are so much more complex and nuanced than it is in solar. In solar, you're just following the trail of silicon. And for the most part, those are all made in one factory. Now there's a lot of factory segmentation. So one specific factory will only take materials from another supplier from their one location of manufacturing, to help make the traceability process easier. But one of the key, manufacturing processes and batteries is just mixing a whole bunch of different raw materials, chemical elements together in a lot of these midstream refining processes. That makes traceability quite a bit more challenging, not to mention all the different potential mines you would have to trace back to, unlike solar, where you're just kind of fixated on where's that quartz mine. So battery storage is really going to be a lot more complex than solar. Luckily, solar brought a lot of the traceability protocols and systems, and a lot of PV manufacturers also make battery storage products these days. So there are some sharing of knowledge and process that can go on, but there's definitely huge risks for the battery storage industry.
Thank you. And we're almost at the end of our time here. Looks like we have time for one more question. So I'll open this one to both Brian and Mike. What is one piece of policy clarity that you feel the market needs the most? Or what's on your policy wish list? Like what's a piece of U.S. long-term industrial solar policy that you think would be effective? Either or, you could jump on.
I mean, I think we see the biggest risk and unknown right now is the 232 proceeding, and let's just get on the other side of that, and hopefully it's not adding 10. They're not coming up with some creative way to stack tariffs across every component that ends up in the module, and we don't end up with a tariff that's untenable even with the high energy prices we have. There are so many ways to fix our domestic energy and renewable energy and solar policy that I don't even know that it's even worth listing them out, because there's just a lot of things that are broken. The whack-a-mole, every month it's a new challenge is a huge tax on the industry. But it's a tax on the U.S. energy supply and the conversion from fuels to power that is going to happen one way or another. So there's a lot of broken stuff there.
Thank you.
I mean, I'll take the cheater answer and say I'd love for time travel to exist so we could go back to the pre-OB3 and be more effective as an industry to solve some of the issues that we're living in now. But short of time travel being developed, I agree with Mike. I mean, the 232 is potentially a nothing burger. It's potentially the sort of Damocles hanging over the entire industry. And I think, today it doesn't keep me up at night because we don't know. And we don't know how it's going to be published. And so, it's like being worried about death. It's going to happen and you don't think about it all that often. At some point, we just need these rules to be defined. 232, Solar 4. We're at a point in the U.S. industry where we are all sprinting towards July 4th, 2026 to preserve the industry for the next 4 years. And this tremendous amount of macro uncertainty and policy uncertainty and FEOC, updated rules and guidance is certainly part of that stew of risk and uncertainty. It just is freezing the market. And I talked to a lawyer just prior to this call who was saying, we want to do it right. We don't know how to do it right. We don't want to bet wrong, but we have to make a bet. And I thought that so perfectly encapsulated this existential crisis that exists in the industry, whether you're a manufacturer, a buyer, or a developer. We just want certainty. Tell us the rules of the game, let us engage in it, and let's move on.
Thank you. Well, I think that's a good place to close it off. A lot of clarity still needed. We're going to try to provide as much of that as we can, reporting the news here at PV Magazine USA. Thank you to all three of our panelists. Really appreciate all the insights that you shared today.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Take care. All right. Well, thanks again for our panel today. A lot of great insights, whole lot to navigate with the U.S. supply chain. Hopefully you walked away from that with a little bit more clarity on the decisions to make for your business. So now we're going to move on and do our prize reveal. As we announced before, the one winner is going to win a 1-year digital subscription to PV Magazine. So let's go ahead and spin the wheel and find out who won. Corey Geiger, you have won a 1-year digital subscription for PV Magazine. Congratulations. Our team will be in touch with you on how to access that. All right, we're now going to move forward to our final presentation of the day. We're going to hear from Eric Goodwin of OMCO Solar, who's going to discuss OMCO's role as a U.S. solar tracker manufacturer. Eric Goodwin is the Vice President of Business Development for OMCO Solar. It's the nation's premier factory direct manufacturer of solar tracker and mounting solutions for community, commercial, and utility scale projects. Eric spent the past 15 years promoting the advancement of renewables, and he's helped position OMCO Solar as a leading manufacturer in the U.S. solar industry. So we'll hear from Eric Goodwin now. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Eric Goodwin. I'm the Vice President of Business Development for OMCO Solar. I'm based out of Phoenix, Arizona. It's great to be with everybody talking about a very important topic to us as an industry. And, when we look at domestic manufacturing and when we look at where we're at, obviously these are very challenging times for the industry. Over the last few months with the One Big Beautiful Bill, and still questions around FEOC guidance. A lot of changes have happened in our industry that have caused some headwinds. And one of the things that we know over the last couple of years is we've seen a significant growth in domestic manufacturing. But as this has happened, it still isn't enough to be able to meet the huge power needs that we have. And so in many ways, the policy that our administration has isn't matching what's needed. And what I would like to do today is we look at these challenges that we're talking through with many different experts in our industry through working with PV Magazine in this event. I'd like to talk a little bit about what OMCO Solar is doing to try to address that. I'd like to talk a little bit about our history, our products, We've always been in domestic manufacturing, maybe before it was popular, even before the IRA. That's always been our business model. And so we're looking for ways to add value to our customers and to be able to support safe harbor efforts, to be able to support short lead times and continue to grow our footprint. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about OMCO as a company, and then kind of dive into some of the differentiators or capabilities that we have that is being able to add value to our customers. And then, I'd like to be able to kind of wrap up on kind of the bigger picture of domestic manufacturing. What can we do as individual companies? What can we do regardless of policy to continue to grow this? And so, what I'd like to do is start out and just talk a little bit about our company and our products. Our company was founded in 2007, so we're 70 years old this year. We just celebrated our 70th birthday. We're a roll former of steel products. We have 5 manufacturing facilities all across the U.S. I'm talking to you today from our Phoenix, Arizona facility, which is where we started our solar business in 2007. We also have facilities in Pierceton, Indiana, Wickliffe, Ohio, which is our corporate headquarters right outside of Cleveland. And then we have two facilities in Alabama, one in Talladega, and our newest one in Huntsville came up in 2024. And with the Huntsville plant, it puts us up to 13 gigawatts of annual capacity among those 5 plants. Our core products on the solar side are single axis trackers and fixed tilt racking for commercial, industrial, DG, and utility scale markets. OMCO is a little unique too because we also make many different products. We make truck and trailer bumpers for the transportation industry. We make material handling components. We make data center pieces, a lot of different components for data centers that are roll form steel. And then we also make the back rail, which is part of our solar umbrella, but we make the back rail in our Alabama facility and our Huntsville facility for First Solar, Series 7 panel out of that facility in addition to our own products. And that was an opportunity to add domestic manufacturing to that module. All of those other markets and products, we're a contract manufacturer. So we're taking drawings from the customers, building to print, and then shipping out. What's different in our solar piece is both our tracker and our fixed tilt products are OMCO design. OMCO is the OEM, original equipment manufacturer for those products. And so, that's a bit unique. We're a U.S. steel company across all industries, but as of last year and will continue to grow into this year, solar is now our biggest market. And that's attributed to a lot of the growth that's happened because of a previous policy, a lot of the focus on U.S. manufacturing and that growth. And so, with that, another thing about, our products, our fixed tilt product is been recognized by Wood Mackenzie as the market leader. I think we did about 1.2 gigawatts of fixed tilt projects last year. And then we've launched over the past year into the utility scale tracker market. We have continued to grow market share in DG market, but the utility scale market and a lot of the larger 100 plus megawatt tracker projects are now also what we're tackling. So, that's a little bit about OMCO from just a history standpoint. When we look at the areas from where we leverage our domestic manufacturing capabilities and we look to add value to customers, there's really kind of 3 areas. One is our factory direct model. We're very unique because we actually make every structural component for our fixed tilt and our tracker products in our factories ourselves, including torque tubes for trackers in both Arizona and Indiana facilities. So it allows us also being vertically integrated from the time we get a purchase order to engineering drawings to manufacturing in our plants to delivery on site to commissioning a tracker. Everything is vertically integrated in-house. It allows us to make changes on the fly. It also allows us to have some of the shortest lead times in the industry, which as we're looking at current, there's a lot of projects, a lot of customers that are looking to pull things in to hit tax credit dates or to hit safe harbor goals or to try to get things done even before the end of this year, even though we're in October right now. And so, from that standpoint, the factory direct model has been really key for us. Another piece that has been a differentiator that we've really developed in the last few years is really driving innovation. We're becoming not only a steel manufacturer, which has always been our legacy, if you will, but we're also very adept now at driving technology innovations. And so we're becoming a technology company as well. And a really good example of that is we launched at RE Plus a few weeks ago our OMCO Star proprietary tracker controller. And we launched that at the show, very successful launch. Now we're doing projects with that controller. And there's innovations that we've brought out of that around how we handle number of network control units to number of tracker controllers. Zigbee is usually the platform that's used, but we've been able to address a sub-gigahertz method. It's called LoRa, which stands for long range, which really allows us to do more tracker controllers with less controller units. So that's an example of some of the things we're doing innovation-wise. We have a team that's also looking at extreme weather events, how we handle hail, how we handle snow on our tracker product. And so there's a lot happening in that space as well. In addition to just looking at our total product roadmap. We know that we have to improve. It's all about cost a lot of times too, but we have to improve our product year after year. So we have an ability, again, to do that in-house has really been big for us. And so we've got the factory direct capabilities, we've got kind of the technology piece, and really kind of from a third spot, and something that we're really proud of is the impact on the community that we're able to provide by creating jobs in our communities. We're in 4 different states, and so the teams that we build and the way that we try to give back to the community is really important for us. And I think it's a huge part of when you're doing a project site. I know a lot of times from a development standpoint, it's really key to engage with the community and to get them involved. But when we're able to create jobs and show that solar and renewables, these jobs are real, these jobs are high paying in many cases, and have good career and good futures attached to it. And so, we're very proud about that. And the other part of that is the growth that we've had. We've been able to expand and see people's careers grow. So, I think that community piece is one that's very important. It is very important for us at OMCO. So, looking at what we've done as a model, again, we never changed anything when the IRA came across. We've always been one that we've been able to leverage our domestic manufacturing capabilities. And I would just say, in closure, when we look at domestic manufacturing and we look at our current environment in Washington with our administration, I look at it as our president has said that domestic manufacturing is a priority. Our president has said that we need to be energy dominant. And our president has said that we need to win the AI race. And so, our policy isn't really reflecting that. And obviously there's a lot of things we're doing to try to lobby that, to try to change that, to leverage the support that we have on Capitol Hill. But we're not going anywhere as an industry. And, we're trying, at OMCO, we want to be part of that growth. We want to continue to drive that. And we want to continue to hopefully see policy catch up with what we really need to do. But I'm very bullish on our ability as an industry to continue to weather the storm and grow. And looking forward to seeing how our team at OMCO can add value for our customers, our partners, projects across the nation. Really appreciate the time today to talk a little bit about this challenge that we face and what OMCO is trying to do to address it and to improve things. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much to our friends over at OMCO Solar and Eric Goodwin for sharing some of the U.S. manufacturers' perspective. And that concludes the second day of PV Magazine USA Week. We've learned about solar manufacturing ramping up, trade policy clamping down, and the road ahead for solar procurement. Thank you to all of our speakers and panelists today. Appreciate you sharing your expertise with our audience. And special thanks to our partners, our lead partner, Create Energy, Platinum partner Trina Solar, and gold partners Intertek CEA, Q-Cells, and REC Group. And of course, thank you to the PV Magazine team, both here in the US and in Berlin, who are working behind the scenes to make this event possible. Remember to join us again. Tune in tomorrow for our third and final day. The theme is distributed energy as a solution. Distributed energy, including rooftop solar and energy storage, offers many solutions to myriad problems. It offers resilience from power outages and extreme weather. It offers ratepayers clarity on electricity costs for the next 20 plus years. And it can also be built quickly, avoiding issues with interconnection queues and delays. Speakers on day 3 will explore how distributed energy is overcoming these challenges with innovative solutions. So tomorrow, you can expect to learn a review of how residential and commercial solar, as well as community, can cut costs and remain competitive. We'll learn about how distributed energy offers solutions to complex problems, including that faster deployment of project and creating a more flexible, more resilient grid. And we'll look at how distributed energy plays a role in stabilizing electricity in the face of sharply increasing grid demand. We'll hear from our keynote speaker, Nick Montoni of the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center, which leads on tracking state policy, among many other initiatives. We'll hear from Danielle Murfield of Q-Cells and the positioning of a module manufacturer in supporting the build-out of distributed energy. And then our main panel will feature analysts from Wood Mackenzie, the California Solar and Storage Association, the development side with Revision Energy, and the energy marketplace operator Energy Sage. So it should be a really exciting panel. We're looking forward to seeing you all tomorrow. And thanks again for joining us today. This has been another installment of PV Magazine USA Week 2025. See you all tomorrow.